Hello and welcome to another GIS Day Celebration event. I'm so happy to have our guest, and we have lots of exciting things to talk about. A lot with PPGIS and just participation, and we'll go through it. We've got a slide deck and some just things to talk about. So I'll turn it over to you. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I will introduce myself and then we can get going on what is PPGIS. My name is Leo Lerner, and I am in the Spatial Science Institute at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And you can perhaps tell that I come by way of London, which is to say that I lived in London for 22 years and then moved to Los Angeles to do a PhD at the Spatial Science Institute in population health and place, it's called, which is all about people and how and where and why they are living successfully or not, and all to do with kind of that public health, geography, sociology, philosophy. And I'm bringing a kind of a lot of geographic background to these things, which is, I'd say, pretty different from a lot of the backgrounds that people have in the Spatial Science Institute. And so I've been kind of working alongside and clashing a little bit with a lot of these data scientists and computer scientists, and that has been super fun. And I've learned a lot from them, and hopefully they've learned one or two things from me. And yeah, this is what I've been working on, thinking about every day for the last 4 years. So it makes a lot of sense to me, but I have been thinking about it for hours and hours a day for the last around 1,300 days. So if it doesn't make sense to you, I will try and make it so.
Well, I'll ask questions, and I have a lot of enthusiasm for what you are sharing. And that said, I share this with you as I am also a student at the University of Southern California in the USC Spatial Sciences Institute, and I just find it to be an amazing program, and I am so joyful to be there. But I'm building off of an urban planning degree, and so that was me kind of learning not quite geography, because you have a background in geography. I'd like to just kind of just ask that for a second. What where geography and sort of urban planning intersect, because they're different, but they have similarities, because we both care about places and people. And obviously the PhD program you're in cares about health as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so, the biggest question in geography is what is geography? Classic to social science problem is, what is science? What is society? And I would classify myself as a social scientist, right? Which is an interesting space to be in as a 2023 researcher and practitioner in science. Given that, like I say, it is fairly contested as to what society is. And it is fairly, again, multiple, contested, diverse as to what science is. And you know what? I don't really know anything about urban planning, despite the fact that you say these are fairly cognate disciplines. I know that I live in a planned urban environment. Where does geography fit into that? Well, everything happens somewhere. Nothing is absent of space. Nothing is absent of place attachment. And geography is really about, what is that place? What has that place come to mean in the social framework of the urban or of the human or of the population? And exactly like you say, the public health aspect of that. I have no background in public health. In fact, when I came to USC and when I came to Los Angeles, one of the big questions is, similar to what is geography, is what is health? And I would say 4 years later, I still have no idea. And no one has given me a good answer yet. But I think it's something to do with, you being secure, or, a person being secure in the place in which they are moving, in the place in which they are kind of navigating the rhythms of life. And that is super different in Los Angeles. It's super different where I am in East Los Angeles than it is down by where USC is in South Central Los Angeles. It's super different in the Valley, super different in the rest of California, super different in the rest of America. And for sure, I would tell you it's super different in London. And, those are the places I've been, right? And it's kind of infinitely different based on anyone's experience in all those different places. So a kind of crazy answer to your question, what is geography's relation to urban planning? But something like that.
Well, I'll give an example of a project I'm working on right now, which is sort of an immersive 3D storytelling on the Port of Long Beach. And a port is hugely valuable for economics and for the stuff that we all have that we bring in from around the world. And I was actually surprised how much stuff comes into Port of Long Beach, Port of Los Angeles that gets trucked, mostly trucked, but some train across the entire United States. And so actually that was there's a chloropath math about that, sort of where does all of those goods go. But it's also highly toxic. It is so polluted near the port. And so there's a huge health impact for those who live in the neighborhood because there's just so many particulates and the air pollution is high. The water is just toxic because of the power that these boats need. And then when they have congestion and they have the boats just kind of hanging out, waiting to kind of come through, that's just creating higher levels of pollution. So that would be an example of where urban planning, geography, and health kind of intersect.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's one. I've got another one for you. The day before yesterday, so Sunday, the 10 freeway, right? The East LA interchange is the biggest or the most trafficked freeway interchange in America, if not the world. And thousands, literally tens of thousands of those trucks that come from the Port of Long Beach, the Port of Los Angeles, go over that intersection daily, hourly, right? It is one of the busiest and most important pieces, physical structures in the American business infrastructure and, to a larger extent, the global business infrastructure. And on Sunday at about 8 in the morning, or maybe slightly earlier, on one of the kind of what are they called, flyovers, bridges, there was a huge fire underneath this freeway. The flames were sort of 200 feet tall. And it was because it was being used as pallet and hand sanitizer storage. Why? Well, somewhere to put it, right? Under the freeway, keeps it dry. And super interesting for a kind of health reason, right? Firstly, because, like many freeway underpasses in Los Angeles, there were several hundred people living under there. And it was being used as a kind of storage space. And so you have this, massive fuel store that was ignited by, whatever cause, it's uncertain as yet, on state-owned land underneath this incredibly important, business and physical piece of infrastructure that was completely engulfed in flames for hours and hours. Hundreds of firefighters there on Sunday for a long time, right? Fortunately, no one was directly killed by flame or smoke inhalation. But outpouring of, exactly like you say, millions of tons of particulates, maybe not millions, but plenty of particulate matter, burning up this concrete, burning up all these pallets, all this hand sanitizer, huge flames, huge smoke. And that freeway is now closed indefinitely. 2-mile stretch of the freeway is closed. And it is, I'm looking out my window, it is a couple of miles away from where I am. That intersects with, for sure, the urban planning. That intersects with the global business infrastructure. That's going to have a huge impact on kind of supply chain cost. Literally just because the trucks are now taking more fuel, idling in traffic and going around the detour around this thing. So it adds, to the bottom line of, anything that's coming off those boats in Long Beach. It's adding to, traffic, which is horrific for people's lungs in East Los Angeles. And, geography in that is, well, this is a physical thing made of concrete, made of rebar, that was completely out of human control, right? A completely intractable part of the urban infrastructure was essentially destroyed. The pictures of the freeway are, concrete that is just completely decayed, right? Disintegrated from fire damage. And that is closed indefinitely, right? California is not a controlled place, despite the fact it's a huge economy, a huge budget surplus every year, billions of dollars. A fire has, not crippled, but has massively impacted the Californian economy. That was completely out of anyone's control, right? For all sorts of reasons, social, people were living there. It's contested as to how the fire started, but, all sorts of avenues to explore there. Used as storage for hand sanitizer, used for pallets. And under this freeway, that is super contentious for all sorts of reasons, right? The banner of urban regeneration in the 50s and 60s has led to these huge kind of relics of division in the city, right? It's very different. This did not happen in Beverly Hills. It did not happen in Santa Monica. This happened in East LA, on Alameda Avenue, which is very different to the West Side, for example, and pretty different to down by the Port of Long Beach too. But anyway, again, another long story talking about geography.
And that brings me to one more that, with of course, that inspires something else in you. We'll continue, but we'll begin our slide presentation at this point. But so actually, our capstone project in urban planning was really focused on wicked problems. That some of these problems are intractable and cannot be solved, and it leads to sort of stakeholder engagement and how you can chip away at them, and you can at least understand the different perspectives. And so our final project, which actually now I'm sort of doing a 3D map of the Port of Long Beach, but was actually about the 710 freeway and about the fact that it sort of ends when it hits Pasadena, because the Pasadena would never allow the 710 freeway to be built through Pasadena. They were like, yeah, no, not here. And that's a really good example of community participation and them saying, yeah, no, we're not standing for that. You can go around or you can end it, but you are not putting a freeway through our city. And so it sort of ends up being a problem in the fact that it does all these goods that need to get around, all this pollution, and there's certain people who are in the communities along the 710 freeway who are impacted and have real health consequences. I was actually on a phone call, on a webinar meeting with the Clean Air Action organization for the Port of Long Beach in one of their stakeholder engagement calls. And two of the participants who live in the neighborhood just said, I watched my father die, then I watched my mother die, and I'm going to die soon because, we are directly impacted by in our health because of the pollution that we're exposed to here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but I will quickly say that wicked problems, and that framework for understanding, contemporary issues is a kind of foundational theoretical cornerstone of my PhD dissertation, right? Exactly like you say, wicked problems are maybe not unsolvable, but they for sure have contested solutions. The idea of, how do you solve climate change? How do you solve all sorts of health issues? Impossible to frame that, right? Because of incredible diversity of perspectives. Interesting then that you say, the South Pasadena, right? The city of South Pasadena, exactly where the 710 stops, in Alhambra, is an interesting example of community participation for sure in kind of urban planning, the kind of geographical makeup and social makeup of urban decisions. Only afforded to that community because it's incredibly wealthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly like you say, the 710 goes from where does that San Pedro and goes up to Alhambra, goes through Compton, goes through Lakewood, goes through Vernon, and Huntington Park, and the disadvantages are planted on those communities, and the benefits, the economic benefits of transporting goods and whatever, are extracted from those communities, right? It's a kind of form of extraction that, and they were not participant in the decision making, those communities. When it came to the rich neighborhood of South Pasadena, and they had money and they had some kind of faculty to resist that decision, it became eminently possible. And so this participation based on means, based on among other things, race, income, is a fundamentally geographic problem, right? Where are these things happening? Well, they are happening in differentiated aspects, right? The bad things are happening in low income, predominantly non-white neighborhoods, and the good things, tax dollars, income and revenue, are extracted and taken to, for example, South Pasadena, taken to the west side, where they don't have to breathe in the 10,000 trucks going down the 710 every day. So yeah, super interesting. That is geography. That's why I'm here.
Yeah. And okay, let's begin. You've sparked many more ideas, but I will just I'm going to turn it over to you. So we are here for GIS Day, and this is the kickoff of the Maps Data Design channel. And so let's talk about environmental participation in PPGIS.
Yeah, let's. So like I say, this is kind of this is my thing, and this is, I think, what I would like to immerse myself in is for as long as my geographic career extends, right? Environmental participation in PPS. What does each of those things mean? I started by saying, what is geography? Well, hey, what is the environment? What is participation? And what is PPGIS? No one knows, or some people think they have an idea, but let's talk about it. So let's start with environmental participation and kind of the background and the meaning of where this came from, this idea, right? And I want to start, as many people do, as the kind of tradition of science, with some dead white men, right? And their thinking from the kind of mid 20th century. And we'll start with Kurt Lewin, who was, I think, commonly referred to as like the father of psychology, or the father of American psychology. And he had this thing called action research, or he codified the methodology of participatory action research, right? Which is performing science with the simultaneous taking of action, right? So using science and using the process of science and research to do something, right? So some kind of collaborative process between scientists on the one hand, right, or scientists and researchers, and people on the other hand, who are directly involved in some kind of issue. So he did a lot of stuff with, clinical and health trials, and a lot of stuff with kind of more psychology stuff. And this for sure is going to feed into what I'll talk about later on. And second, again, dead white man, is Jürgen Habermas, the harbor master of contemporary participatory understanding of what science is, right? And we'll start with him in 1981, deliberative democracy. And as opposed to kind of Kurt Lewin's background, which was in like sort of trade unions and psychology, this was really like politics, philosophy, and economics, the great tradition of PPE. And his kind of central creed was that for decision-making to be legitimized, to be accepted, it has to be preceded by some kind of deliberation, authentic discussion and discourse between different people, right? As opposed to, for example, again, the tradition of politics, the aggregation of preferences by some kind of election or some kind of voting process. It has to have this kind of period, or ongoing period, in fact, of debate and discourse between agents, which is, again, going to be foundational to what we'll come to. And, alongside this, or as a result of this, we get to, sorry, these are quite text-heavy slides. They get less and less text as we go on. We get to this kind of conclusion, right? Which is that to have successful science, you need to have some kind of action which is implemented in collaboration, right? With evidence-based, or as it's come to be known, data-driven collaboration and analysis to investigate the world, the social world, the physical world, the natural world, the chemical world, the whatever world. And again, foundational to that is that anyone should be able to take part in that discourse. I say should be able because, as we were talking about with the 710 freeway, many people are not able, based on lots of things, to take part in these things. The positive outcome of this would be that anyone can introduce a claim, a knowledge claim, and anyone else can challenge that claim, right? And you have this period, this ongoing process of deliberation, and you kind of either narrow in or broaden out onto a set of acceptable decisions. And so we come to this thing in 1998, right, in Denmark, the Aarhus Convention, or Aarhus Convention, which is a UN, or at least the European part of the UN, convention in environmental justice, environmental decision-making, public participation in decision-making. And I won't read the whole thing out, but essentially, right, it's codifying those things that Kurt Lewin and Jürgen Habermas are saying, that every party should, in science, have access to the entire process, right? And what does that mean? Well, every party, anyone who's affected, right? Anyone who is either subject to these decisions, or the decisions are going to be implemented upon them, anyone who is taking part in the data generation, the data analysis, or anyone who's taking part in the kind of reporting or interpretation of those materials should be somehow involved in that process. That would be fantastic. And this was, I love this idea, right? That anyone should be able to be involved at any possible phase. Of course, it essentially never happened, right? It's a lovely idea. And I am trying to do it in my own dissertation, in my PhD work. It's incredibly difficult to even do in that, right? In the relatively narrow framework of Leo's dissertation, it is almost impossible to do this, right? So scale this up to the United Nations, an incredible set of challenges. And I will pause for a second here to say that like I said, there's this incredible tradition of referencing white male scientists, but foundational to my thinking. Before we went on live, we were talking about our kind of shared family background at Oxford. I was at the Oxford School of Geography, or Oxford University Centre for the Environment, it's called. And foundational to my understanding of all sorts of geographic issues were these three people. An obvious thing which they have in common. Katerina Landstrom, Sarah Watmore, and Gillian Rose. And I reference them, I would say, daily, right? If not, in citations, in my own thinking and how that came about. Super different to Jürgen Habermas, to Kurt Lewin, and to a couple of the other scholars that we'll talk about later. But, bear this in mind, that the tradition and the convention of the white male rich professor is unsuccessful, right? The wicked problems, as we talked about, are impossible to solve if you only reference that, again, pretty narrow knowledge base. Okay, so that is my short aside into situated knowledges and my situation. Contemporary participation, participation in 2023 splits down into two spheres, right? There's, on one hand, decision making, the kind of philosophy, politics side of participation, the Habermasian side, and on the other sort of hand of that, there is the science side, the sort of more Kurt Lewin-esque side. Decision making and participation is commonly perceived as like a democratic right. People have the right to participate in decision making processes, either through voting or taking part in political discourse or in some other means. There's some kind of intrinsic value to participating too, right? It's recognized that having people in there is probably a good thing. Normatively, it's a good thing. Incredible focus on process, right? So it's all about, how do you get these people in? What is going on with them? How are we engaging these people? And it's an inclusive thing, right? So the more people, the better. And as well as representation, the more types of people, the better. Versus, or at least parallel to this, or perpendicular to this, is the scientific participation, right? Where participation is not a right, it is the choice of the scientist or the choice of the funder or the grant writer or the institution to engage people who are non-scientists in research, right? As opposed to being intrinsically valuable, it's commonly used as a kind of a means to an outcome, right? So you have a set of scientific processes and you say, okay, well, let's get some people in and the outcome will be better. We can get more publications. We can have more successful papers that will have more citations if we have more people, or not. So I doubt, this is a field that I don't know anything about, but I doubt there's much participation in theoretical mathematics, right? Just because the way of engaging people is very different to something like health research or social research. Yes, outcomes are super important. It's all about your ability to contribute. So rather than just, having contribution for contribution's sake, there's this great focus on, what will these people be bringing and how will they be bringing it? And kind of relevance, right? Relevance, I say, because in a lot of National Science Foundation, NSF grants, there is this commitment to a broad, wide audience, wide outreach. And one way you can do that is to engage non-scientists or engage non-experts in science. This is only recent. I think it was like 2017, maybe a little earlier, that became part of the NSF grant writing process. So, this is all to say two very different ideas of participation, right? And yet, we were talking for ages at the beginning about the parallel, very close spheres of something like urban planning and something like geography, right? Where you've got some decision-making, some science, moving along at very different speeds and along different trajectories that result in kind of similar things, like the construction of the 710 freeway, or like, boats moving around Long Beach, right? These are all decision-making based on some kind of scientific process.
Well, I want to add to that, because I think one of the gaps that I see and problems that I see is I hear everything you're saying about having this idea of this discourse and these parallel tracks. But I think one of the issues that we're seeing a lot and I would say specifically in American culture right now, is misinformation and miseducation, and how like a lot of science has been put into the media and co-opted and coerced and become something it's not, and then people become science deniers and election deniers and all sorts of other things, where I feel it's really important to give scientists a platform to speak and to put good science out there, because this democratic process only works if people have a baseline of information that is somewhat grounded on truth.
I ostensibly I do agree with all of that, apart from the very last word, right? What is truth, right? Well, and again, it's such a social scientist thing to literally put what is in front of any word, but in this instance, right? What is truth? Like, does it mean something that is objective rule of the universe, right? In which case, pretty hard to refute, right? Gravity, drop something and it falls down. Some kind of objectivity there, in that if I lift up something, it is not probably going to float away, probably. Versus something like, again, to reference it again, the 710 freeway, right? What is true? Well, is the 710 freeway good? Very difficult to have an answer to that question, right? Is the 710 freeway beautiful? Well, by many accounts, no. But some people really do have an appreciation. For sure, when I drive under the 710 intersection with the 105, I'm like, wow, this is an incredible feat of civic engineering. It is impressive. It is somehow beautiful, but it is not, a Raphael masterpiece, right? It is not, you would not see that in the National Gallery, right? It doesn't exist in the kind of same sphere as subjectivity. So yeah, ostensibly I agree. I think scientists do have a responsibility and should be given a platform to diffuse true ideas. But is that good or bad? Is the truth good or bad? I mean, again, such a social science trope, but what is good? And is that beneficial for society?
Well, I guess where it comes from, let me add this kind of piece to it, is that when you say, hey, there's not this discord in certain math, well, because that has true to, we assign truth to math, that math is inherently true.
Yeah.
And so that's where I sort of say that these things that have discourse is because there's the openness for an opinion or perspective. And so I think the discourse is important, but to make sure that that discourse is respectful and active, and that all parties who have a place to participate in it. And so we have this idea of a participatory democracy, but to be aware of who's not at the table, who should be at the table.
Yeah, should is a really kind of critical word there, right? Who should be at the table? Well, everyone, someone, no one. It's super difficult. And again, I don't know much about maths, but I am jealous of that, right? That you can write a maths paper and it will hold up forever, right? It will always be correct. 1 + 1 probably will always equal 2, but hey, maybe not, right? It may change. That's kind of one of the kind of foundational understandings of science, is that it may not always be the case. It's very difficult to have objective scientific outcomes, which is why social science is so cool, right? It completely depends on your background, as opposed to, you're saying, okay, is this right? Is this correct? That is something that is not afforded to natural science, or is not afforded to the physical sciences, the hard sciences, right? It does not exist there. And I am proud of that in social science. I think that contested knowledge is a good thing. I think it will lead to good outcomes sometimes.
Yeah. But I guess where and you've all great points. I guess where I was going with this is that I think that I just see that science, well, a couple things about science. For me, coming from an arts and creative background, there was a point where I felt science, I was not actually included, or I didn't really understand what it was. And it just felt like there was this other that I wasn't welcome in. And it took me joining a program, first in the certificate and then now in the master's, where I'm getting a master's of science, and I can own this identity in science and understand a bit better what science is, and seeing that science is to me actually has, I always kind of came from a creative background, and there's a enormous creativity in science because you have to identify problems, you have to explore, you have to look for possibilities, you look for and build on the work of others, you have to make your research replicatable so other people could potentially get the same result as you did if they followed the same process.
Yeah, and I think essentially, if I have one criticism of science to the creators of science, that is a failure of science for the last 250-ish years. Post late modern science, it didn't work in terms of getting the right stuff. Yeah, it had very successful outcomes, right? It made a lot of people very wealthy. It created a lot of scientific innovation. It also led to some incredible injustices, right? For example, climate justice, climate injustice, and many other things. But that's why science communication and science public relations is so difficult, right? It's so difficult, and I don't think that scientists are always the best people to tell others about their work.
I have so many creative friends because I came from arts and media,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I think all of my creative friends, I'm like, every artist needs to pair up with a scientist. Y'all
Yeah.
can learn from each other. And truly, I commend all of the people in science who come onto my stage and speak, but I know that not everybody is as comfortable raising their hand to participate because it's so foreign to them. And so yeah, and because I have this background and I'm intersectional, that is why we're here. so
Yeah.
so continue on. I love this, but I just wanted to contribute like that idea that I think the dialogue is important, and I think that to be able, I think the biggest part is, and maybe, and this is what I was talking about when we say truth, is the idea that some people have such a fixed opinion and they've come to the table. I think the point of these dialogues is to be able to evolve your thinking, to take in new ideas and to say, oh, I hadn't considered it that way. And I can now go forward with a new idea that eventually matures and evolves the opinions and thoughts that I had before. That I don't just leave the conversation saying, well, I believe this because I got it from this source and I'm never going to change my mind.
Yeah, and I do think naturally people of different training, people of different background are better than that than others. Again, not to slight mathematics, I think it's an incredible discipline, but I presume that mathematics is the training that I have learned from kind of secondhand, is that it is a very kind of resolute set discipline where it is difficult to have a kind of postmodern mathematics. Again, that surely exists, but I don't know much about it. Anyway, I'll stop talking about mathematics before I get in trouble. Okay, so I'll pick up here. Let's see what's next. In the US, right, there are lots of kind of environmental decision-making actors or actants in the network of decision-making, going all the way from kind of political authorities at the kind of federal, state, county, and lower levels, as well as international conventions like Montreal Protocol, Paris Agreement, ICPP, IPCC, and so on, as well as all these environmental agencies or agencies which are environmental affecting, like the Environmental Protection Agency, USGS, NOAA, USDA, NASA, many others, right? Depending on the breadth of your definition of the environment, essentially every government department, every other agency, many impacting agencies. So for sure, like the transport ones, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, huge tracts of land, huge tracts of space in the US and in other countries and in the ocean, that are controlled, that have impacts from decisions taken by these agencies. Plus, this whole other sphere, non-institutional sphere, which are landowners, private, public landowners, developers, all sorts of development, energy companies, agribusiness, and so on. Think about Bayer and Monsanto and how great of an impact they have on every part of the kind of Earth system. So we have these kind of international, national, local, regional, and local actors. All of that is to say that environmental governance, the performance of decision making in the environmental and other spheres, is multi-level, right? It happens at different hierarchical, so-called hierarchical stages. It is multi-sited, it is polycentric, right? It is not, as I will kind of demonstrate, a straight chain of, input, process, output. It's a distributed thing. So this is very different to environmental science, right? I don't want to pull apart this dichotomy too hard, but in environmental science, there are for sure like public universities, public institutes, public centers, which are kind of relatively transparent in that a lot of their work is produced for open consumption. And we also have private environmental sciences, like businesses and think tanks, and to a certain extent charities, right, which do not produce materials for wide consumption, wide absorption of that knowledge. Again, multi-sited, polycentric, united by this kind of common epistemology, right? Epistemology, the way of knowing things, probably related to the kind of convention of science, right? Which is that you formulate a problem, you undertake some kind of research process with a set of methods, you create a set of materials, you analyze it and report on that. So united by these processes, by these discourses, by the same tools, right? A lot of these agents in this network use the same stuff to get incredibly different outcomes, but they are united by that use of the same stuff. So a little bit like we were just saying, right? This is the imaginary of how we get from one to the other, right? We start with university science, right? The kind of contemporary paradigm of knowledge generation is in universities, right? Is in the kind of the academy, right? So we start there in whatever discipline you like. It somehow gets to policymakers, right? Through collaboration or through reporting or through conventional kind of science politics relations, and then again somehow gets to the public, right? Through policy impacts, through spending, through whatever, right? It somehow goes from the policymakers to the public. Cool, that would be great, right? If you have this neat chain where you start with knowledge, you get to and you come to some decisions, and then you have the implementation and you have the outcome. That would be great. Of course, as I just kind of alluded to, it doesn't really look like that. It looks more something like this, right? Where many different agents, many different pathways, all these nodes in the network are connected by, and again, this diagram is even inaccurate, right? All these straight lines. That for sure doesn't happen, right? The lines are crisscrossing, the lines are curving, the lines are spiraling and going back on themselves, or misinformation. They are going in a direction that is non-planar to their meaning, right? And this is more of a representation of the reality of science and politics, right? Science, politics, public, how knowledge moves from the lab to the Senate floor to the middle of Kansas, right? Wherever, right? How does science get from one place to the other through this thing of politics in the middle? Well, in a complicated way, right? So this is what I kind of have. And it's left my gray text in the template. But it looks something like this, right? This is the compromise that we come to, right? On the left-hand side, this blue side, we have the impossibly complex reality, right? The world in all its complexion. Going to this other side, ignore the middle for a second, going to this other side where you have research outputs and decisions, right? So you have the world on one side, and then you've got on the other side, the outcome, right? The representation of that world. Representation kind of by definition has to include some kind of abstraction, some kind of modeling process where you take that impossible complexity and put it into something that is possible, right? Something that is representable on a computer system or in someone's brain. And in the middle, coloring this flow of from the world to words and other outputs are researchers, right? This is contentious, right? And people would look at this and say, hey, that's not what I'm doing. But kind of by definition, this is what researchers are doing, right? Taking some part of the world that they are observing and examining and changing that from its, real world phenomena, and through kind of processes of phenomenology and distillation and all sorts of things, taking that and squeezing it through this bottleneck and sending it out into the form of words, right? Something that is possible to represent in a set of sentences or in a diagram, in a some kind of representation. And yeah, what did I put at the bottom? Assumption: scientific research will impact on decision making through this bottleneck. So I don't know. This is the end of part one. I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts or comments so far, but this is what we are. This is what we get to so far.
Well, I think my thought and my comment, which I think is just reiterating where I feel like there's a PR gap in science, especially as you presented it, which is the science goes to the policymakers. But the problem I have with the policymakers is that they want to co-opt things because they want to win elections. And so there's an agenda there. And really, if they win elections because people vote for them. So I think that there's a place to engage the public so that they can actually vote for the people who are going to make those policies that they feel benefit them based on their understanding of the research and the science.
And that is not to say that scientists themselves do not have an agenda too, right? You know, it's pretty easy to for many people to kind of understand, yeah, politics, you know, their agenda is they want to do stuff that is perceived as likable by enough people that they can win the next vote to keep them as in power, right? Scientists have essentially a relatively similar thing, right? Where the more publications, the more citations you have, the more funding you get, the more money you get, the more acclaim, the bigger, greater your reputation. That is, you know, for one thing, it's very rare to see negative results published, right? It's very rare for someone to do an experiment and say, it didn't really work like we thought. So we're not going to publish that, right? It's not going to get picked up by a huge journal. It's not going to get citations. Let's do it again, or let's change it slightly so we get this kind of more you know, exciting outcome that is more heavily cited, and we can continue to do our work in the future. That, you know, that we call it a publication bias. All sorts of other agendas too from science, like again, not to dwell too heavily, but the ClimateGate scandal of University of East Anglia in England, right, where they were kind of cherry picking these special set of results to further a certain understanding of climate change by an individual university that had huge impacts for the understanding of climate change in science, in politics, in the kind of public imagination too. And you know, I speak of my own discipline and others. You know, the path dependency of geography has been, you know, people leaving Oxford, people leaving Cambridge, going to a exotic foreign location, studying the population there, bringing back the knowledge to Oxford, to Cambridge, to London, writing it down, and selling a book as a result of that. People looking at the book and going, "Wow, look, this person went to wherever Cook Islands, and look, wow, look, aren't the people there so different from us? That's cool. I'm going to buy a book about that." You know, that is a relative simplification of what truly happened, but you know, not quite. You know, and that for sure still happens, right? Extractive social science and stuff like that is it happens right now, daily, everywhere.
No, that's true. I mean, things are only going to get researched if they support an agenda, which is, can I get funding for this?
Mm-hmm.
And it does this confirm my own beliefs, interests, ideas. And so, yeah, I think all of that is very true. But I like I said, at some point we all sort of just play our individual roles, and you obviously are doing it in a PhD program and exploring all of this, which I think is fascinating. And you know, for me, I'm learning the GIS to the best of my ability, and I often fall down tech holes, and it takes time. And I am finding great joy in this. There is a sense of, I don't really know what I want to be when I grow up. Like, I haven't really figured out, like, what does my job look like when I graduate, but I've just found joy in the fact that I've done communications for much of my professional life and I'm very comfortable with it. So I was like, maybe we can play in this space.
Yeah, it's a fun space to be in, right? Like I said at the beginning, everything happens somewhere. There's always going to be a demand for analysis or interpretation of geography, right? Of place attachment. Whether people like it or not, that there will always be a demand for geographers, and that's why it's the best subject. Okay, let's go to the next part of it, right? Which is who are participating? Who are these people that are going to break the bottleneck? So you can see here in these pictures, right? I typed in scientist, I typed in researcher, and it came up with pretty similar things, right? If we take Google to be the kind of, rough vox poll of what people think, there's this particular imaginary of science and of research, right? Which is people in white lab coats. In fact, it looks like some of the exact same set photos are used for the same photo shoot. It's people in a closed and hermetic environment in which nothing can escape that space apart from scientific outcome, and nothing can come into that space apart from the materials to come to that conclusion, right? Which we'll come back to in a second. So participants, right? These are kind of conventional understandings of who you might engage in research, right? Individual members of the public, this is crazy word, right? But individual members of the public, people. Practitioners, right? People who are somehow organizing or who are community agents or run a kind of institutional organization, right? Someone who is doing something. Civil society groups, so a lot of kind of rivers, for example, have a lot of people attached to them who are trying in some way to protect the river or to somehow advocate for the rights of the river, or trees, or anything, particularly environmental stuff. People gather around a set of issues which they care about. Birds, for example. Stakeholders, right? In the broader sense of the word, everyone lives in the environment, so everyone is an environmental stakeholder. People who are holding a stake in something, people who have a vested interest in the issue at hand, right? In the matter of concern. Bonus, right? And again, this is where I might lose some people, but it's truly something I believe in, right? At the core of every scientific inquiry, right? In every act of science, and Philip, I'll test you and ask you, who is at the core of science?
Who is at the core of science? I want to say we are.
What do you mean we?
We as living, breathing human beings who are the ones who have health and bodies and minds and live through air and water and sunshine and dirt and move through the world and are subject to gravity.
Pretty much, right? That is true, right? That at the core of science, there is a person doing science, right? At every kind of scientific, in any sense of it, apart from, if we consider that the AI is doing science, I'm not sure of that yet. But at the core of science, there is a person or a set of people, right? Even in these pictures, right, of science, in everyone apart from this one of just some test tubes, there is a person, right, doing that science. And if people are familiar with the Apple TV show Severance, right, there is this kind of common illusion that when you enter the lab, you lose everything that has affected you, or everything that has gone into your personhood from the outside world, right? So you enter the lab, and in Severance, there's this kind of crazy scene where the depth of field changes, and they very clearly become like a different consciousness, right? So you open the door of the lab, you close the door behind you, and the outside world is outside. Your outsidedness is outside that, and you are in the lab, and you are just a scientist. There is no humanity. There's no humanitas in that. Obviously, that's not true, right? There is no such technology that can split your conscious between in lab and out of lab, or in research and out of research. Surely, right? These people, even though probably they are just models and actors, apart from there's Einstein up there, these people bring with them all sorts of baggage, right? So they bring with them their situated knowledge. As I talked about before, I'm coming into my new understanding of the world based on what some people told me or what I read in some books, right? It's not just my intuition. It is some learned behaviors. And, they bring with them their background. They bring with them their family. They bring with them what they ate in the morning. They bring with them this kind of incredible legacy of what makes them a human, of what makes them conscious, into the lab. And that will impact, or that will have an outcome on the science that they are undertaking. I believe, right? And I think, I essentially think this is impossible to refute, right? There are people at the core of science, and those people are not just robots. They are not just machines that make knowledge. They are people that come in with all sorts of sets of stuff and do stuff either for their job or for their fun or for research or for their studentship or the scholarship, and create science, right? That is contentious, but so, all science is participatory, right? At the center of science, there is someone doing participation, working in science, who is a human, who is willingly involved in that process as a participant. Yeah.
One of my favorite books, which I think it's called The Knowledge Web. I think it's a James Burke, and it is basically a whole story of the history of science and technology.
Yeah.
And the basic takeaway was that every invention was basically a retooling of someone else's idea or a happy accident. Like, it really kind of leveled the playing field. Like, there were no geniuses. They were just people who stared at a problem for a long enough time that they were able to unravel it. But for the most part, all of the things we think about as just having a wow factor to them, like I said, came down to some very basic things.
Yeah. The basic of consciousness and of situated knowledge, right? How you came to that situation. What is your epistemology, and how does that influence how you create stuff? Centrally, I think. Okay, so the public, right? What is that? Well, let's have a think about it. Oh, it's messed up the arrow there. So the public, right? When people say, "Oh, public participation," it's the first P in PPGIS, which we will come to if in time. There is a continuum, right? There is a spectrum of public from a very narrowly focused, well-defined set number of people, right? People make up the public, all the way along the spectrum to a complete amorphic, right? Very loosely categorized set of people, right? Maybe they have no relation to each other at all. Maybe they have only very thin connection, either proximity or, some ideology or something that's connecting these people. But anywhere along this spectrum, right? You are extracting a set of thinking processes that will influence and will set the agenda, or at least set the register for the science that you're about to produce. We go from this kind of, like I said, clearly identifiable public selected by personal closeness, either geographic or non, to an issue, to a completely disparate, less than tangentially connected set of peoples. This definition, right? You have to pick where you are in this spectrum. You have to define your understanding of public, because that is going to fundamentally change the types of outcomes that you can achieve, right? It's the first P in PPGIS, public participation. What is that? What does that mean to you? What does that mean in your work, in your team's work? Who is the public? You got to set out with that. For example, decision makers, right, themselves participating in some kind of process that may be democratic or otherwise. A group of elected officials defined by legal power and legitimacy, discuss, or neighborhood leaders defined by their relevance and urgency and relevancy to an issue. Again, discuss. What is decision making? What is practitionership in this kind of contemporary deliberative democracy?
Isn't it Tobler's first law of geography?
It would be, yeah. That everything is connected, but near things are more connected than far things. To which I would, add, well, what is the connection? Is that connection just physical? Near things. I am 3,500 miles away from where I came from, but I still have this incredible connection to the pub landlord, and I still have this credible connection to my family or, my neighbors, in that, we share, for amongst other things, cyberspace, online space, online connections. And, some kind of more than physical, a metaphysical connection, which is not represented in a GIS, right? It's very difficult to show feeling in a GIS, right? To show the connections of, my heart, my longing for a bag of chips from the seaside, right? It doesn't, you can't display that by a very kind of simple line. But yeah, Tobler's first law, or Tobler's first law plus, I would say. Okay. And then we come to this idea, right? Which this is again a kind of central core of what has influenced my thinking, and I encourage essentially everyone to develop this central core, and it is a kind of moving boundary of your understanding of the world, right? And mine came through being a nerd and reading about this for 4 years, but these two, Schlossberg and Schuford, are two kind of Oregon practitioners, one academic, one kind of non-academic, in the kind of policy sphere, who wrote this kind of amazing summation of what is the first two P's of PPGS. What is public, what is participation, and I encourage people to read that if they're interested in this, or at least see where it falls in the kind of broader canon of public participatory literature. But this idea, right, is pretty. I like it, right? That publics are constituted. Publics are not set objective groupings of people, but we come to them through these kind of contextualizing, right? A local public, an interested public, an affected public, or material public, right? These could be things like, there is a tree in my neighborhood, and everyone who lives within 100 meters of the tree is somehow connected to the tree because they walk under it every day, or they see it every day, or a material public, everyone who has size 9 feet, we are interested in what is the difference between your foot moving off the curb as you step down onto the curb between someone who has size 5 feet, probably some kind of difference, and so on, right? So we get these through contextual positions, and these constitutions are expertise, right? Again, I said it quite a few times now. I have quite a few central kind of creeds to my understanding and my interpretation of these ideas. Everyone is expert in their own lives. I think that is pretty difficult to knock down, right? To say that everyone who has some kind of existence as a conscious person, they are the expert in their experience. Right? No amount of writing, no amount of representation can perfectly encapsulate that expertise that they have in their bodies and in their minds and in the connection between those two things, if you are a dualist. And to ignore this is not just bad research practice, but I think it is just bad understanding of knowledge, right? That, if you say, okay, people are not expert in their own lives, I am expert in these people's lives more than them, then you are dismissing, a whole set of experiences which fundamentally make up what people are. And I bet people who do say, oh, I am more expert than other people's lives, would say no one is more expert in my life than me. So kind of double proof that. I also can hear some feedback. Is that okay?
It sounds good to me.
Okay. Beginning. So, think about this. What lives, what experiences does inquiry, or your scientific inquiry or research inquiry, impact or touch? Or, how is that's better. And how are those experiences connected? How can you incorporate those experiences into your framing of the problem, into your wicked problem? What is the wickedness of this problem, and how are these experiences come together to formulate this? And how does expertise, or how does that understanding of expertise, change the framing of your environmental problem? Like the ships in Long Beach, that is presumably very different than from where I live in up on the hills of the east side than if you live in the Rancho Palos Verdes, right? Completely different spatial understanding of those problems. Okay, so finally we connect these two terms, right? Public and participation. Temporarily, these are the set of definitions which have come to define public participation, right? Intentionally taking part in activity related to the environment. So willfully involving, or willful involvement in some kind of environmental activity. Public, some set of people clustered together in relation to something. Again, temporarily agreed on definitions. I predict and I expect these definitions to change depending on space, depending on time, depending on all sorts of things. And then we also come to this, Arnstein's Ladder of Public Participation from 1969. And she had this conceptualization of participation going from, climbing the ladder from these two, like non-participatory therapy, manipulation, implementing science on a people, with no willful involvement, with no willful engagement of the people who it is being implemented on. Then we get these kind of tokenistic ideations of science, placation, consultation. I've been to so many, not that many, but I've been to many public consultations, right? Where there'll be a kind of village hall or town hall or something, and they'll say, this is what we're going to do. If you don't like it, write down on this piece of paper, and we will take that into account. And then they get the piece of paper, and who knows what they do with that piece of paper. Maybe they shred it, maybe they read it, and it somehow works its way into the understanding of the decision. But maybe they don't. It's impossible to know. There is no participation beyond the decision makers and scientists going, this is what we got, here you go, have a look at it, and then they take it away from you again. And then we get up into this top bit, the green bit, at the top of the ladder, right? Arnstein's climbed up here and she said, this is citizen power. This is partnership. This is, you take the science and you put it on a plate and you go, hey, everyone, come and see what is going on here. Take it off the plate, put it back on the plate, turn it around, flip it upside down, throw it up in the air, whatever you want to do with it. This is now ours. This is us as a science, as opposed to mine. This is not as opposed to mine and you. This is us doing science together. So some kind of collaboration, right? Some kind of connection between research and researched, and the boundary and the kind of filter of that. And that is the end of part 2. So that is, who is being involved in this? I don't know if you want to interject and have any thoughts on these things.
It reminds me so much. We did a stakeholder engagement class in urban planning, and so we were introduced to Arnstein's ladder. And then we had a project, and actually this is what led me to the ports, because we had to look at a case study for public participation. And I ended up doing the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. And they actually, in my view, based on that ladder, they had the best. They had over 500 public meetings with stakeholders that were not about presenting. They were about workshops. They were about evolving. They were like, let us learn from our stakeholders. Let us incorporate their ideas. Let us come back and represent, saying, here's how we incorporated what your concerns were, what your ideas were. And that we were, they were very clear about what their agenda was in terms of creating their 2050 master plan, but also wanting to do it very thoughtfully, very thoroughly. And so it's possible that you can have this participatory experience with a government-led agency. It was really impressive what they had done. Now the task is, can they actually implement what they've beautifully written as far as what they intend to do? And actually, now that I'm in a project management class, we could ideate anything. And I ideated a port project to do a 3D digital twin that aligns with their master plan, that sort of says, okay, we're going to map and track the implementation of this master plan and its continuing evolvement with stakeholder participation. So that was just kind of a nod to what you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, Arnstein's ladder, it's such a simple idea, but eminently applicable. Good idea. Yeah.
And then we also had another project where we had to kind of look at a place that we were living, and I have spent quite a bit of time in Colorado, and I lived in Boulder. And I basically looked at Boulder is a very white place that's very liberal and very, hey, we're a big umbrella and we love everybody, but we're really white. So you looked at their Einstein's ladder, and Boulder actually fell kind of in the middle of that ladder because there was a lot of tokenism. And they sort of said, did they have festive things that celebrated other culture without actually having participants of that other culture? And they did sort of straight sort of flips on language. So yes, there's the English and the Spanish version of the website. And it was just, it actually just really hit the mark that their level of participatory nature, even though they're perceived as being really open and really liberal, was further down the list than one might imagine.
I saw this incredible instance of Colorado politics, intersecting with ecology and kind of environmental systems, where it was on the ballot sometime last year, right, in a local election, where they're saying, should we reintroduce, I think it's wolves to the Colorado wilderness, or Colorado, rural spaces. And the measure, I think, passed, or at least was very close to passing. almost perfectly split between the white kind of liberal cities, Denver, Boulder, and so on, against the rural, right? So and in the kind of pockets of the urban, they're saying that sounds so cool, right? Let's have the wolves out in the Colorado countryside because rewilding normatively is good, right? Reintroducing megafauna to the landscape sounds great, right? And then the farmers and the people who live in the countryside are saying, no, 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 like this is going to be so awful. And it was completely diametrically split, right, between the urban and the rural, and alongside also some other things, wealth and income, which what is the deliberation in that? Because that is essentially a referendum on the state, that is completely split between where you live in the state, right? If you live in the city where it is unlikely that the introduced wildlife would come and sit in your back garden, although I don't know, Denver's pretty kind of naturey, versus in the countryside where you're like, yeah, I'm probably going to be encountering these, much more often than you, and they're going to be eating my livestock, they're going to be chasing my dog, and so on. So very kind of interesting intersect between geography, politics, and nature, and the idea of introducing a relatively intractable species to the landscape.
Well, that actually echoes like exactly to where my family is, and I spend quite a bit of time in Pennsylvania, and we're in rural northeast Pennsylvania, but it's really a suburb of New York City. So many of the people have houses in as second homes, and they're because they don't drive in the city, they'll get their driver's license in Pennsylvania, so they'll become Pennsylvania voters. So they're voting in these elections, and they're voting about the deer, and it's so contentious because anybody who lives in the rural and knows the rural wants to have a cull of the deer, because if you have too many deer, they get sick, they spread disease, and they eat your future forest. They eat everything.
Yeah.
And having an appropriate population of deer, and they have the master plan for the community says this is, how many deer per square mile is appropriate. But all the city folks get all wound up and all, you can't, I'm like, you're the same person. You eat a hamburger. You're not a vegetarian. You eat meat, but there's something about Bambi. They can't kill Bambi. And so it becomes such a contentious issue that they consistently vote to not have a culling, because they're city people and they don't want to kill Bambi. But if you're a rural person, you sort of say a culling is appropriate. They have a hunting season for a reason. You want an appropriate population of deer. It's healthier for the entire ecosystem, because the deer will eat the food of the other animals and actually cause harm to other animals in the ecology, the ecosystem. So that is something where similarly there is such a rural urban divide. And but I also think there's a lack of education, because I was such a city person until I moved there in the pandemic and suddenly was like, oh yeah, it's a totally different experience and a totally different way of thinking when you actually live here full time. And I wish I could have the opportunity to educate people to evolve their thinking.
Well, I mean, this is that is expertise, right? This is your understanding of your situation, your place, and how your body is interacting with this landscape. Is very different if you live in the city versus if you live in the countryside, where you see these deers all the time. That again, it boils down to like what is by definition perhaps true, and what is good and what is acceptable to a set of voters who are voting on actionable outcomes, like not killing or killing thousands of deer every year. It depends what the people deem acceptable or deem to be normatively good. Depends on, among other things, where they live. So yeah, definitely.
But these are city people who have a country home and can vote in the country.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're just having a rural population vote on a rural issue. You're having a city population vote on a rural issue and a rural population vote on the same issue. But because in that particular community, more of the people actually have it as a second home and are from the city, or even if they've moved there recently full time, they're from the city. They think like city people. They don't think like country people. Yeah. And so it reminded me what you were saying about Colorado, which is everybody is where they are. They're either in a city or in the rural area, in the mountains or the plains, but they're all sort of voting on the same ticket. because
Yeah.
they're united by the geography of the state.
It becomes slightly tricky though, right? Because this is that is a constituted public, right? You're saying, okay, well, how about just people who live in the country can vote on country issues, not just and maybe you do some allotment of nights spent in each house, right? That's your weighting of the vote. But then you go further and you say, okay, well, only people who are deer experts can vote on this, right? Because they should know the best. And then you say, well, actually, what about only people who are deer experts and have guns and hunt deer? And what about, go further, what about only people who are deer experts, have guns, hunt deer, and are within 100 meters of a deer right now? And, you can pretty quickly see that, for example, right? You say, okay, so many things in American politics now are based on pretty small identity groups. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about each one, but you say, okay, well, how about this? Each person is only allowed to vote on stuff that affects their identity group. That would, I think, pretty immediately be politically unacceptable, right? But, I don't know. It's interesting to explore, if not as a thought experiment, then perhaps as an actual political experiment to be like, okay, well, what are people's connections to these issues? Right? One example I perhaps might have is that the United Kingdom, right, is a united set of kingdoms, right? Scotland and England, Wales and Ireland, or Northern Ireland. And in 2014, there was this referendum to determine, okay, is Scotland going to break apart from the Union? Is Scotland going to disunite from the Union? And only Scottish people voted in that referendum, right? Interesting, right? The referendum didn't pass and Scotland has continued to be a member of the Union. But what if they said, okay, everyone can vote on this? Everyone in the United Kingdom, everyone who this, kind of affects, right, or at least geographically, right, Scotland touches, is a land border with England. We say, okay, anyone who lives, in a country that touches Scotland is allowed to vote on this. Well, what would the outcome have been? Would it have been that all the English people would be like, no, obviously keep Scotland, we like Scotland and Scotland there? Or would all the extra English people gone, no, actually, Scotland, go away. We don't want you to be as part of the kingdom. So very interesting kind of political experiments potentially in the future based on connection, based on expertise, based on experience. I wonder if that will potentially be a thing we'll see in the future. Anyway.
All right.
Yeah, let's keep going. So I've got to discussing kind of what environmental participation is, kind of discussing who may be participating. Now I'll kind of come to the kind of, I guess, the final part, the kind of conclusion of this, which is that we get to putting the participatory into the GIS and what that looks like. So GIS, Geographic Information Science, is it's GIS Day, right? So probably people who are reading this have some kind of understanding of what GIS is. Has a huge range of stakeholders, right, of affected parties. And this creates a sort of, I would say, fairly unique or at least fairly novel opportunity for some kind of change, some kind of influence for this field to be involved in kind of decision making or a scientific inquiry in the present and future, right? I'm not going to go through every single one of these, right? But in the kind of four realms of expertise, right, we've got different sets of expertise, place specific, right, all those kind of different levels, spatial hierarchies, all these kind of critical sciences, and then we come to this one, which is perhaps I will focus on a little bit more, which is like anti-science, right? Which we spoke about a little bit in part one, right? Misinformation. Why is that interesting? Well, it's not wrong, right? Anti-science is not incorrect, depending on what or whose definition of scientific truth or scientific correctness you adopt, right? So, for example, how do you put and this will sound funny to a lot of people. How do you put understanding or conceptualization of flat Earth into a GIS? Well, pretty easily, right? Because GIS is on a screen, it's flat, it's in 2 dimensions. So makes sense, right? What about this? How do you put something like a secret space into a GIS, right? Every single square millimeter of the world is able to be seen in incredible resolution by a satellite. Well, slightly more difficult, right? A secret space that doesn't exist, sort of, I don't know, Pandora's box of space, right? How do you put that into a GIS? Well, it becomes more difficult, right? But engaging these kind of anti-science perspectives, New Age, perhaps some kind of proto-religion or novel religion, and a kind of alt science, is taking up a huge part of scientific discourse. And to ignore that perspective is ignoring like these incredible range of knowledge claims that can be beneficial to scientific inquiry. And I think it is important to at least acknowledge them or somehow account for them.
I did a piece on open street maps for India and China. Mm-hmm. And it's illegal in China, but it's more illegal if you were to try to document a military facility or anything that is sort of that secret space of highly secure. But I just thought it was interesting that there's a very active OpenStreetMap in China, although even participating in it is technically illegal. But then there's a higher level of criminality if you were to document something that they do not want documented.
Yeah. I mean, very super interesting topic, right? Is the mapping and kind of resistance to the kind of conventional nodes of mapping, right, which are for property accumulation, military purposes, and geointelligence, is pretty different than what many people use maps for. Resisting and kind of insurgent to that kind of discipline and surveillance. Anyway. Very, very quickly, I will kind of think about this mode of geographic information engagement, right? From Michel Callon, another kind of prominent thinker in the PPE space that I have applied to the GIS space. Three kind of models, right? We have the education model, which is parallel to Einstein's ladder, or at least alongside Einstein's ladder, is a kind of one-way deficit model, right? Where there is a set of people who are low knowledge, and there is a set of people who are high knowledge, and we are kind of moving knowledge between that group, and nothing is kind of really flowing either way, right? Then you have some kind of dialogue, right, which is more collaborative, more interwoven, right? You have researchers and the research and the knowledge is kind of moving between them. There's no kind of framing there, right? People are not involved in really the science. They are involved in the kind of data generation and data collection. And then you have this kind of co-productive, right? Co-production, which is a huge buzzword, particularly I would say in wicked problem formulation, right? Which is collective learning, which is people doing, return to Kurt Lewin, return to Jürgen Habermas, doing science for something where they are getting stuff out of it. People get different stuff out of different science. My participants in my PhD, for example, they're like, oh, what do I get out of this? And I'm like, well, what do I get out of it is I get, a PhD degree and I get, some kind of, recognition for that contribution to the canon of knowledge. What do you get? Well, you're participating in science as someone who probably has never participated in science before. And you're kind of setting a, new precedent for engagement in geographic information science that is beyond the conventional set of integrated parties, right? That is beyond the white middle-aged man. That is beyond the academy. That is beyond the specific institutions that have been accountable for a vast majority of geographic information science, and loads of other stuff too, right? We get cool maps and we get some, other benefits, stuff like that. So Callum calls co-production this kind of transdisciplinary ambition, right? So different disciplines get different stuff out of different modes of science, but all of them get something out of it, including the affected publics too. And it is at once, the way in which scientists and publics, engage with each other and, share the investment in a matter of concern, as well as a historical process, right? So institutions, that is, all those agents that I talked about that are doing environmental science and environmental decision making, come to mutually shape each other, right? And determine how themselves and each other's way of addressing themselves and each other will evolve and adapt in the future. And so again, relatively foundational and interesting to think about when doing participatory science. I'd say pretty critical for GIS, right? Because think about the background of GIS and think about what it was used for in the beginning, as opposed to what it can and could be used for, potentially much broader ambitions and much broader application. And return kind of pretty spiraling back to this diagram, right? But I will apply it to GIS or to GIS science. We've got the kind of 5 realms of GIS science, right? Hardware, software, data, people, and process. And we've got the outcomes, right? What do I put? Maps, spatial analysis, data management, evidence, some kind of decision making. The compromise between those things and the orange things on this side is we've got these GIS experts in the middle. What is expert? What is expertise? Well, everyone is expert in their own lives. GIS people are expert in GIS, are expert in spatial analysis and spatial science. But what is the stuff that they're doing? Where did that come from? It probably came from a set of people that are connected to an issue that could have a say and in fact do have a stake in this relationship, right? And should be put in there to either kind of expand or break this collar between one and the other. Okay, and then one way of doing that has been Carl Steiner's Geodesign, right? Which this book it's an Esri Press book from 2012. Sums up many of the things that we've been talking about. Geodesign, well, design, right? It is the design professions. It is all sorts of things that are things and processes and objects and phenomena which are made for human use and made for human interaction, right? It is Carl calls it an effective and symbiotic collaboration amongst 4 realms, right? Design professions, designers and all sorts of things. Geographic sciences, so spatial scientists, geographers. Information technologists, so people who are making the outcomes through things like human-computer interaction and computer science, conventional computer science, and the people at the core of this, who are the people impacted by change. And I like the way that the front cover of the book is drawn, but I would expand the purple circle to encompass everything in this, right? People of the place is everything. Design professions live in a place, information technologists live in a place, geographic scientists are in a place and are connected to a place somehow. Even people who are on the other side of the world, right? I could go on OpenStreetMap right now and do some mapping in, Rajasthan, for example, in India. And I've never been there before, but I would somehow be connected to it. I somehow have a stake in that if I am, tracing the buildings on OpenStreetMap.
I have some advice for you on that one.
Yeah.
Apparently, because they have cricket fields or playgrounds in India on OpenStreetMap, they had to sort of say, hey, we just make sure that like in the West, playgrounds are for children, but in India, playgrounds are for sports.
Interesting.
And so there was a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I mean, definitional attributes change depending what place you're in. Exactly like you've just described, right? And how do you find those things out? Well, you got to ask people who are in that place, somehow connected to those places. There could be a field guide for definitional, for attribute data for all sorts of things, right? In people's houses, say, well, that's my water fountain, but it's actually not for water. It's actually where I watch the birds who come and do bird bath. And other people say that's my water fountain, but actually I practice casting my fishing rod in there. And other people say that's my water fountain, but actually I drink from it every day. All sorts of different, completely unpredictable, completely unexpected things from the same set of definitional attributes. Which is why what Carl says is something like designing for change is not a solitary activity. I think imagine an OpenStreetMap where it was just me doing it, right? If I went around and made the attributes and made the node data for every single thing in the world, it would be almost unusable for almost everyone, right? People would look at this and they'd be like, this is not useful for anything that I can think of. The more people you have, probably the more people it's useful for. It's kind of old Linus's law. But yeah, just like engaging more than the soul, the solitary agent at the center of the science are probably, I would say, in general, most of the time leads to better outcomes, which is why there's been incredible growth in kind of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary and just bigger team science, especially recently. Okay, not much left. I've got a couple of examples of environmental PPGIS in practice. These are the kind of consumery, or at least kind of openy, phony sides of things, right? So we've got like citizen science, like iNaturalist and stuff like that, where you walk around with your phone, take a picture of plants, and then other people will say what plant it is, and each of those things has a location data attached, and you can very quickly work out where different plants are. Almost everyone I speak to now is really into native plants in Los Angeles. Like, it seems like to be the thing that people are interested in now. And everyone's got this app and everyone's on it all the time. And it is PPGIS, right? It is people willfully involved in a kind of scientific inquiry that has, space and place data attached to it every time you use it, and ecology data too. GPS traces, right? So almost everyone moving around America and many other countries has, at least one GPS trace either in their pocket or in their car or wherever. And using that data for all sorts of things. Geotagged images, again, almost every picture or every digital picture taken has a set of GPS coordinates in, and you can scrape those images from anywhere, right? And say, okay, this is what the picture is of. This is where it was connected. How are those things here? What is the social meaning of these images? What is one person takes an image looking this way, one person takes an image looking this way. They're in the same place, but they have two completely different things. That's incredible, right? Why has that happened? One more example of that is, downtown Los Angeles, the same picture, I could look at the US Bank Tower, right? And in the same place, I could turn around to the other side and take a picture of Mount Wilson. Same georeference, but two things that are almost completely different from each other, right? But reference to the same place. We have like individual consultation responses to decisions. So, however you interact with anything can be polled individually, right? And that is often used for kind of site suitability and kind of polling acceptance across different spaces. And you also like lots of kind of discursive and material participation. So this image on the lower right is from somewhere in South Asia where they were doing some kind of urban installation of, I think, hygiene facilities. And they're saying, okay, well, where would it be good, right? And there's 40 people around this map pointing to different places and saying, how about here? This is what, this is a street corner where I walk past every day. And, this is a park, this is an open space. And that, feeds pretty directly into, political and infrastructure outcomes, based on where these people put their hands on the map and interacted between what they know in the world and what they can represent on the Cartesian platform and translate those things into kind of an outcome. Yeah, so again, some more kind of temporarily agreed assumptions and temporarily agreed definitions. Pretty key to PPGIS is the idea that local populations and gathering information from these people is more useful than information compiled from outside. For example, the cricket one, right? Like if I just went around and digitized every cricket pitch in India, I don't know, I could do it relatively accuracy or with a kind of some degree of accuracy, but I bet people who played on those cricket pitches and who work on the grass and mow the lawn and everything could do it more accurately than me. Again, what is accuracy? Difficult to discern. But, that this is a pretty fundamental idea, right? That engaging people and discerning the nature of their expertise alongside yours as practitioner is good, is a kind of normative good, will lead to more often than not better results. And secondly, like, again, returning to Kurt Lewin as in the very beginning, participatory GI science empowers local communities, right? Does something for a situation at hand, for I keep saying matter of concern. That's a kind of Sarah Watmoreism, right? For something which is agreed upon as, or, is accepted or accepted or not as something which is affecting more than one person, or even if it is just one person, getting involved in that person's life. Becomes easier and easier, right? As the cost and the effort to do GI science decreases with each kind of technical innovation. Okay, the penultimate thing is that This is not without challenge, right? And I will return to this binary of science and decision making, although perhaps it's not so much of a binary as a kind of two interwoven spheres, right? Science, the uptake of co-produced knowledge, and how does co-production work in the world of publication bias, in the world of agenda-based science, in the world of gendered science too. How does co-production work in that sphere, in that world? And the kind of stabilization, narrowing in on a set of useful participatory methods and techniques. In my dissertation, I'd say I have between 5 and 8 roughly, like set of methods that are used to generate materials that you can make interpretive conclusions from. And what is the value for environmental careers? Well, hopefully I think large, great. But other people might say, well, it's difficult to put a figure on that. It's difficult to determine how much that's worth, as a salary, or how much that's worth as an investment or as a grant. And again, in decision making, right? New practices, new modes of politics, new modes of getting that information from science to the public introduces uncertainty. And kind of like we talked about, uncertainty is the enemy of the political agenda, right? It is not, uncertainty is bad. You want a leader who is completely certain in what they're doing, and that tends to be politically more successful than kind of sporadicism. Institutional corporate continuity of memory, again, similar thing, right? It is corporate and academic and other agents have this kind of inertia and like doing the same thing that they've done for the last 250 years. It worked for them very well, didn't work for other people very well, but it worked for them very well, so they are likely to keep doing it. But hopefully the notion of expertise is widening to involve more and more perspectives and people than just the kind of the norm, the mode. And lastly, I kind of will, to quote several stand-up comedians, I'll leave you with this, which is that these are some considerations which I think participatory scientists and particularly PPGISists should adopt, right? Insider-outsider collaboration is good, right? What is inside and what is outside is difficult to answer, but some kind of connection between inside the academy, outside the academy, or inside politics, outside politics is interesting and beneficial for good scientific outcomes. Why do people get involved in science? Probably to make a difference, right? I think this will make a bigger difference than if it's just the sole hermetically sealed science like that. Local knowledge is essential to the success of any social change project, for sure. I think that's increasingly agreed upon. What is the purpose of your research? Is it extractivism, right? Are you extracting knowledge from one community and writing it down and selling a book and giving no proceeds back to that community from the knowledge from where the knowledge was generated? Or are you providing a set of capacities, a set of capabilities to a group that will be able to chart the course of their own future, right? Not quite, give someone a fishing rod and they can eat forever, but, useful analogy for these kind of things. Who is partaking in the research design? How did you even think about this? Wicked problems, kind of one of the key things of wicked problems are it's very difficult to even determine what the problem actually is, right? In your science, what is the problem and how did you come to know that problem? What was the background to it? How did you formulate this in the first place? Lastly, kind of functional one, like what training do participants need? Do they need a smartphone, right? If people are on the wrong side of the digital divide, are they going to be left behind by GI science? Well, got to think about that. And what kind of training are you going to provide? Like, are you going to teach people how to use OpenStreetMap? Are you going to teach people how to use a GPS receiver to record location of all sorts of things? So kind of two final sentences, right? Participation is emergent, uncertain, and unpredictable as a process. That's the point. That's the good stuff. That's where you get good, interesting things at the margin of insider-outsider, or at the margin of expertise, opinion, right? Value judgment versus fact. That's where the good stuff is. That's where cool things are. So I would say, my interpretation of all of the above is the role of researchers, especially in a place like USC, especially in a country like America, is to create the best possible conditions for participation, right? To use your training and faculty and funding and weight of the institution behind you to create a set of publics that will willfully engage in a set of sciences that will create some kind of outcome that is going to be good for everyone. So yeah, that's what I've been thinking about. That's what I'm going to be thinking about for a long time.
It's a very worthy thing to be thinking about, and I think we all need it. And I got that from when I went to the Esri UC conference in over the summer, and it was my first one. And now I'd been in it for a year. I remember reaching out to somebody a year earlier about something, and she said, "Oh, I won't be available. I'll be at the UC conference." And I didn't even know what it was. So I grew a lot in a year in my GIS understanding, not just of the technologies and the applications, but also in the culture and the events, and just spending 2 days on the expo floor, really talking to people and really understanding that for the tens of thousands of people who were there, I was the only one that I encountered or I perceived. Now I wasn't in a lot of the sessions because obviously people teaching the sessions are more public. But I was like, wow, among all of these people, and I worked so hard to have my seat at the table here. There were no bloggers or podcasters or YouTubers. And I think that coming away from that, that's when I was like, oh, that's what I'm the outsider where I can contribute to this. And that's not to say I've spent a lot of my career around the arts and media entertainment, but I've never been in front of the camera. So there's a bit of a learning curve, like really learning how to edit and how to do good videos. It's taken me the better part of a year just to get my lighting, sound, software sort of sorted out. But with that said, I feel like there's a little place for me to bridge these communications and these conversations. And I think a reference it to media is a commitment to the public, because the communications I do ultimately are designed for the public. So I think there's a lot here, and I just keep learning, and I'm just always excited to share what I'm learning and get to know the people better who are in my networks. And so I'm just so honored that you could share this with us today and be part of GIS Day, and also just part of my launch of a dedicated channel for maps data and design, or maps data design.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I said maybe it might be conceived as off the cuff that scientists are not always the best people to communicate their work, but sometimes they are, right? Sometimes only the scientist is able to recognize their role, right, in the network of corporate, institutional, governmental, international of agents, and the scientist goes, this is where I fit in, and I can tell people that, and I can use my understanding of the problem and my knowledge that I've gained from all of these things, and this is my role in the distributed assemblage in the actor network, and this is where I come in, and for sure I think we are essentially operating in a kind of similar mode, right? My this is crazy to say, right? But all science that preceded the cultural turn is incorrect, right? Is wrong. Obviously, a crazy thing to say, right? And I don't necessarily stand by 100%, but before the cultural turn, right, in the early 90s, scientists did not consider that their own role in science, or at least it was not the norm, right, to consider that. And to be able to say, okay, I am a person and I'm doing science. Well, how does my personality affect the science? In the epochs of science, that is new. That is a new thing to consider, how your role is affecting the outcome and how it will affect the implementation of your work. So yeah, I mean, imagine if everyone read geodesign who was a geo practitioner. Imagine that. It would change so many things, right? Imagine if everyone read it and practiced it. I think the field would change overnight, but I think people could start by just giving it a flick through.
Well, and that actually reminds me, there's books that are on my reading list, and they're actually from the 1940s, and they're from England. And there were 3 books that were written, and one came because I dabble in language learning, and so the loom of language was basically written because a lot of people in England weren't participating in language learning the way that their sort of continental counterparts were. And so it was a very sort of easy to understand. And I'm about halfway through that book, and it's really, really good about language learning. And then he wrote two others. One was Math for the Millions, and the other one was The Citizen Scientist. And it had to do with, let's make this accessible for everyone. Let's give everyone a starting point and not make it so high-minded, but that there's an accessibility for these things, for language, for science, and for math.
Perfect. Yeah.
And I think that there's very much, and again, like you said, we're just, the conversation is changing, the technology is changing, and now I think AI and machine learning are just a whole nother chapter to sort of fold into this. One of the things I was playing with was the idea of creating tabular data from generative AI. And it right now it's not accurate, and it has no center point, and it's limited in the number of attributes that it will give you. But it's the beginning where I could say fire stations in San Diego, fire stations in Oceanside, hospitals. Like if you're doing emergency management, you wanted to sort of just populate a list. That I think that the future is you can actually start to create your own data through AI.
Yeah, I mean, so I have one very kind of brief opinion on this, and I'm not an AI expert. I don't know anything about it, right? But I will say that what I do know is that the code, the script for AI in the first place was written by a person, right?
Yep.
Someone designed it, someone made it. So in everything that AI does, or at least in everything that AI is doing, right, there must be the signature of that person who designed it, right? Like it or not, that person's impact is going to be on every single thing that whatever kind of iteration of any kind of AI tool or model or whatever you're using. And that is frequently under acknowledged, right? That someone made this, and that is going to change how the whole thing works. And I don't even know the person who invented ChatGPT or whatever is called, and I bet most people don't either.
Yep. No, and I think that's where we all just publicly need, you talk about public engagement, need to be the guardrails and need to sort of stand up and speak out for when it doesn't work, because it's built on all of those previous biases and of limited knowledge and of all sorts of inequities and other things. I mean, one of the things as we wrap it up, when I was just playing with data from Cal Enviroscreen, and it was my very beginning of kind of working with R and just creating lines, sort of regression lines, and was wanting to see in the data set, like marrying that Cal Enviroscreen pollution data with census data. And so you could have races and genders and ages, but we were kind of was just trying to see like what story could it tell us? Where did you get a line that mattered, that sort of had an impact? And it really came to race and pollution. So in California, if you are white, you do not have a pollution burden. If you are black and brown, you have a pollution burden. And that was so clearly demonstrated just by playing with the data.
Yeah.
And so now that we have that information, what can we do to improve that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, completely off the top of my head, one thing is, well, the pollution burden, right? That is pretty easy to measure anthropometrically, right? It would be pretty easy to cut open someone's lungs and count the number of PM 2.5 particles in their lungs. But how does that change someone's behavior, right? How does that change someone's mood? How does it change their actions? How does it change their perception of the world from, behind their eyes, and in their body? That is more difficult to measure. And the only way I think you can do that is by engaging them in research, right? And saying, okay, these are some things which we found out. This is, how much roughly particulate matter we think you've inhaled in 20 years of living next to the 105 or whatever. What does that mean to you? And what is your take on it, right? That is what I'm interested in. I'm saying, okay, here's some science, and here's some people, and what do the people feel about that?
Yeah, and the other one, while you're doing that research, that I'm particularly interested in is trees, because when you, I did a color was a red line map overlay of New York from the 1930s to today, and it hasn't changed. It's completely entrenched. And if you are in one of the green neighborhoods, you have access to a lot of green space. And if you're in one of the red neighborhoods, you have no green space. And so it wasn't just along race lines, but it was also quality of life lines.
Yeah.
And so I think that those are things that when you look in Los Angeles with tree cover versus no tree cover, because people who, again, they're wealthier and they're homeowners, they can advocate for that. And if you're don't have, you're economically disadvantaged and you're not a homeowner, you can't advocate for that. And so how a lack of tree cover also, creates inequities, and, and what does that experience actually mean?
Definitely.
And then the other part of it, as these conversations evolve, and then we'll wrap it up, and I'll give you the final words, is a question of when they go to put trees into these neighborhoods, because they say, oh, we see this inequity and we as the city can make a change. It freaks out all the people who live there, because they're like, well, one, we don't really trust the city, but two, you're making our neighborhood nicer and you're going to outprice us, so we can't live here anymore because we don't own our homes. So you get all these other, sort of knock-on issues. So they become wicked problems. It's not like, oh, let's just go put way more trees, that would solve the problem. It creates all sorts of other considerations.
Yeah, and hey, guess what? Those situations are emergent, uncertain, and unpredictable, and the way you can, include them is by getting people involved.
And that brings us to a conclusion of a public participatory GIS. So I appreciate it, because I had not yet known what PPGIS was. I actually looked it up right before our call, and I did find a quote that said, you're making these maps, but you also need to infuse them with local wisdom.
Yeah, and I hate to say that this is the most important hour and X minutes that people would ever hear, but hey, once you've heard this and it is bad science not to abide by it. So if you've heard this and you've got to the end of it, you got to do it.
Yes.
You've seen through the looking glass. You've gone through the door, and now it's actually a one-way door, and you can't go back in.
So what would be the one next step someone should take?
I would say the one next step someone to take is look at your work, look at your GIS, and say, am I in severance? Did I come into this GIS without thinking about who I am? And how can I put myself into this thing that I've made? And then you can go one step further and say, how can I put everyone else in? Right? What is the outcome of this exercise, the outcome of this activity in GIS or any science? What is my role in it? And what are other people's roles in it? And even just thinking about that elevates you above, I would say, 9 out of 10 conventional scientists. So it's a good start to just think about it. It's a good finish to actually do it.
Love it. All right. Thanks. See you next time, everyone.